Mediterranean civilizations, 2000 to 500 BCE. Around 2000 BCE, long after cities and kingdoms arose in the Middle East, the first European civilization emerged on the island of Crete, a prosperous society based on maritime trade that established the pattern for later civilizations on the Greek mainland and other places around the Mediterranean. The people who settled Crete may have reached the island from the north or the east. Whatever their origins, they were seafarers who acquired great wealth and influence through their mastery of ships and navigation. Today we know them as Minoans for a fabled Cretan king named Minos, who, according to legend, kept a beast called a minotaur, half man and half bull, penned up in a labyrinth at his palace, and fed the monster youths sent as tribute from the Greek city of Athens. The far-ranging Minoans once dominated the Greeks economically, and received payment from them in goods, if not in blood. Minoans owed their strength and prosperity, in part to the natural resources of their homeland. The lush plains and hillsides of Crete yielded wool from sheep and wine from grapes, along with olive oil and grain, all in such abundance that were plenty left over for export. The most important Minoan assets were timber and the know-how to craft that timber into seaworthy vessels. All ancient civilizations had boats of one kind or another, but most were built to move along rivers or hug coasts. Minoans had to cross open sea to trade their goods, and they designed ships with deep kneels for stability and high prows that cut through waves. Those ships made them masters of the Aegean Sea and the eastern Mediterranean. Among their trading partners were not only Greeks but also Egyptians, from whom they obtained ivory, gems, linens, and Nubian gold. Trade stimulated Minoan crafts, which included finely decorated pottery, colorful wool textiles, and gold and silver drinking vessels, and daggers. There were several kingdoms on Crete, and their rulers used wealth acquired through trade to build lavish palaces connected with paved roads. Scribes at those palaces recorded in writing official business as goods collected and taxes. This rich and well-ordered society was disrupted by one or more violent upheavals that leveled palaces on the island in the 17th century BCE. A massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera devastated Crete with earthquakes and ashfalls. Palaces were rebuilt after that calamity, and one of them at Knossos reached magnificent proportions. Spread over 5 acres, the palace contained 1,500 rooms, including apartments and workshops for artisans, kitchens, storehouses, bathrooms, with toilets, ceremonial chambers, and subterranean passages. To strangers from foreign lands, this maze-like palace complex would have been a veritable labyrinth, and bulls portrayed on the walls may have contributed further to the legend of the Minotaur. In one fresco, a Minoan athlete grabs a bull by the horns and leaps over the animal. Understandably, the archaeologist who excavated the remains at Knossos thought that he had discovered the palace of the fabled king Minos. According to legend, the brutal exploitation of the Greeks by Minos and his man-eating beast came to an end when the hero Theseus penetrated the labyrinth and killed the monster. That part of the story had a kernel of truth, for Greeks overran Crete around 1450 BCE and inherited what remained of the Minoan civilization. Those Greek intruders were known as Mycenaeans, and like the Minoans, they inspired legends. The Mycenaeans were a warlike people who swept down from the Balkans and occupied the Greek peninsula around 1600 BCE. Their culture was simple compared with that of the Minoans, and when the two groups first came in contact through trade, Minoans were the masters and Mycenaeans were the pupils. In time, Mycenaeans adopted Minoan script and Minoan artistic traditions. Some Mycenaeans came to rival the Minoans as seafarers and traders, enriching their homeland with imported gold and other treasures. Others remained tied to the land and clung to the warrior-like traditions of their ancestors. The Mycenaeans were organized into many small kingdoms, each of which had its own hilltop fortress commanding surrounding farmlands. The most impressive of those strongholds was Mycenae, from which the civilization takes its name. Girded by a stone wall 40 feet high and more than 26 feet thick, the fortress was virtually impregnable. The only entrance was a gate beneath 2 magnificently carved stone lions. Like Knossos, Mycenae may have been the seat of an overlord to whom other rulers deferred. Mycenaean fortresses were smaller than Minoan palaces, but resembled them in other respects. Within the stone walls were workshops for potters, weavers, goldsmiths, bronze workers, and other artisans. The king presided over ceremonies in a magnificent hall called a megaron, with brightly painted pillars, decorative wall frescoes, and a central hearth. The tombs of Mycenaean royalty, deep stone chambers shaped like beehives, were filled with so many precious objects that they were known as treasuries. Among the riches that accompanied kings to their grave were necklaces, crowns, breastplates, and golden masks. One such burial hoard, uncovered at Mycenae, was mistakenly identified by archaeologists as the tomb of Agamemnon, a legendary king of enormous power and wealth who organized the siege of Troy, the city in Asia Minor immortalized in Homer's Iliad. In fact, the tomb at Mycenae held the remains of a king who died in the 6th century BCE, or roughly 3 centuries before the destruction of Troy. Nonetheless, seafaring Mycenaeans could have been responsible for Troy's downfall. By 1450 BCE, they had occupied Crete and were raiding the trading throughout the eastern Mediterranean. By 1200 BCE, Mycenaean civilization was in decline, and the fortresses were reduced to rubble. Drought, civil war, or invasions may have caused this collapse. A dark age descended on the Aegean world, and seafarers from elsewhere in the Mediterranean took the lead in trade and colonization. About 1000 BCE, Phoenicians living among the coast of what is now Lebanon embarked on a remarkable phase of exploration across the Mediterranean. Phoenicians were related to the Canaanites and spoke a Semitic language akin to that of the Canaanites and the rival Israelites. The Phoenicians were never a great power militarily. Their principal city of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos often fell under the sway of conquerors such as the Egyptians. But the decline of Egypt and the collapse of the Mycenaeans allowed the Phoenicians to expand. Their port cities became independent city-states and prospered by sending out merchant fleets of broad-beamed cargo ships filled with oil, wine, grain, lumber, and Egyptian papyri, among other goods. The biblical prophet Isaiah referred to Tyre as the crowning city whose merchants are princes. To defend against piracy, Phoenicians' merchant ships were escorted by sleek war galleys, with hole-puncturing rams jutting from their prows. The first Phoenician colonies were little more than trading posts, where a small number of merchants, artisans, and soldiers lived year-round and exchanged goods with the local populace, refitting ships and guarding the port. Over time, the trading posts grew into thriving communities. Most were located in the western Mediterranean on the coast of Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and North Africa. Chief among the North African colonies was Carthage, across from Sicily. Phoenicians flocked there in the 8th century BCE when Assyrian conquerors overran their homeland. Soon Carthage was the leading Phoenician colony in the western Mediterranean and began planting colonies of its own on the Balearic Islands off the east coast of Spain. Carthage emerged as the capital of a great maritime trading empire whose shipping lanes reached beyond the Strait of Gibraltar and ended up the Atlantic coast as far as Britain. The Phoenicians were not the only power in the Mediterranean during this period. In northern Italy, resourceful people called the Etruscans were building their own city-states and sending out merchant fleets. The relations with Phoenicians were friendly, but one village in Italy grew up under Etruscan rule, Rome. Won independence around 500 BCE and evolved into a mighty city-state that would challenge Carthage for control of the Mediterranean. Long before the rise of Rome as a kingdom, republic, and empire, however, Phoenicians had to contend with Greek colonists who began fanning out across the Mediterranean from their homeland, as it slowly returned to prosperity following the collapse of the Mycenaeans. The Greek recovery began in earnest around 800 BCE when agriculture and renewed trade promoted the growth of powerful city-states such as Athens, Corinth, and Sparta. Economic advances there were matched by cultural achievements, as Greek artists developed distinctive styles of poetry, sculpture, and architecture, and produced great literature in the form of the Iliad and Odyssey, epics attributed to a blind bard named Homer and set down in writing in the 8th century BCE. Literature could flourish only in a literate society, thanks to the invention of the Greek alphabet derived from a similar phonetic alphabet spread by the Phoenicians and easily mastered because it contained only 24 characters. Many Greeks alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lemma, nu, xi, omicron, pi, rho, sigma, tau, upsilon, phi, psi, omega. Many Greeks were able to read and write. For all the differences between their city-states, the Greeks shared a cultural legacy that included the Homeric epic. By 700 BCE, the Greeks were exporting that legacy to dozens of distant colonies around the Aegean and the Black Sea in southern Italy and across from the Greek mainland in North Africa. Colonists were sometimes chosen by lot, and the city-states they founded were politically independent on the homeland, an early sign of the quest for freedom that led to the birth of democracy in Athens around 500 BCE. Olmec of Mesoamerica, 1200 to 400 BCE. The first civilization in the New World arose in Mesoamerica, a cultural zone extending from central Mexico to just above the Isthmus of Panama. The early cultures of Mesoamerica shared many beliefs and customs. Central to their way of life was the cultivation of maize, or corn, which originated there about 2700 BCE. Corn was descended from a wild grass called teosinte. I might be pronouncing this wrong. Native to the region, and evolved over thousands of years as people cultivated plants with larger seeds or kernels. The growing of corn and other vegetables such as beans and squash enabled Mesoamericans to settle down in permanent communities. Around 1200 BCE, villages located along the fertile banks of rivers flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, near present-day Veracruz, coalesced into a complex society called Olmec, or dwellers in the land of rubber, end quote, for the rubber trees that flourished in the area. Ample harvest of corn supported Olmec merchants, artisans, and rulers. Peasants labored to build monuments and work on other public projects when they were not toiling in their fields. The Olmec dressed simply in skirts of breechcloths woven of cotton. They loved adornments such as earrings, nose rings, bracelets, necklaces, and anklets made of jade, shell, or bone. Priests and rulers impressed their followers by wearing elaborate headdresses and mirrors of polished magnetite around their necks. Planting and other seasonal activities were governed by a calendar based on lunar months, and Olmec scribes kept track of events using pictographs called glyphs, which have not yet been deciphered. The centers of Olmec civilization, not true cities, were ceremonial complexes with such impressive architectural features as earthen pyramids, walled plazas, stone temples, and ball courts where contestants played a game of some ritual significance. Rulers and their retainers lived in these complexes, but most of the population resided in surrounding villages. The first great Olmec ceremonial center was at San Lorenzo, inland from the Gulf of Mexico. Later, an even larger complex arose at La Venta, near the coast. Tremendous effort was required to erect the monuments at those sites, including massive stone heads thought to represent Olmec rulers. Shaped from basalt quarried near volcanic mountains many miles away and transported by raft, the heads were inscribed with glyphs which may name the rulers and sculpted with stern features as if to impress onlookers with the might of the men who governed the society. Olmec artists also sculpted jade figurines and clay models representing were jaguars, or humans with ears or fangs of jaguars, animals revered for their strength and cunning by many early American cultures. Olmec rulers may have served as priests or shamans of a jaguar cult and claimed kinship with that animal. Mesoamericans believed that shamans could enter the spirit world and change shape, taking on the attributes of jaguars and other creatures. The ruling families that controlled Olmec ceremonial centers and surrounding villages ultimately lost their grip on those communities. Perhaps they were conquered by rival chieftains or overthrown by subject villagers weary of their constant demands for labor. But we do not know. Around 900 BCE, San Lorenzo was destroyed, and monuments there were defaced. La Venta suffered a similar fate around 400 BCE, bringing Olmec civilization to an end. The Olmec left a lasting legacy to Mesoamerica. Olmec merchants served as missionaries for their culture, exposing people across a wide area to Olmec works of art and beliefs. San Lorenzo and La Venta became models for the great ceremonial centers of latter Mesoamerican civilizations. The Olmec had a particularly strong influence on the inhabitants of the nearby Yucatan Peninsula, where the Maya arose. Many of the elements that went into the Mayan civilization, including ceremonial plazas, pyramids, glyphs, Calendars, ball games, and rulers claiming mystical associations with jaguars originated among the Olmec.